Is there
So
anything else you wanted to talk about? We've been going for like 2 hours.
yeah, I
I'm
mean,
just curious.
I personally love this. We don't have to go much for
I
too
love it
much
too.
longer, but if you do want to go a little bit longer, I do have something like probably like two things left, and they're not even big things.
Yeah, no,
But
I'm not saying we got to wrap it up. I'm just saying, like, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about, right? Like,
yeah, I
that's
do actually.
because
I'm
I
not
feel
sure
like
how
we kind of
much.
beat this section to death.
Yeah, no, we're good. We're good with all that stuff for sure. We are absolutely good with that stuff. But I am curious. And I don't know
Mm-hmm.
if you care about this at all, but I personally believe that Andrew Wilson is wrong about Christianity, and that he's and
Probably, yeah.
and the reason why is because from my research, from everything I've seen, Christianity is the only deontological case for anarchism, and it basically means that
Were you here
they
when I
do, it
discussed
does
this?
require divine law. I know, which is a logical fallacy. I know it requires divine law, but if you accept divine law, it is the greatest moral case for anarchism. And the reason why is
Well,
because, sorry, go ahead.
were you here when you were here when I discussed this?
Yeah, no, I heard. Yeah, I heard what you said. Like there's things
Okay,
in the
okay. I
Bible.
just want to make sure I didn't have to repeat all of that shit
Oh
for
no, no,
that's all I'm
no, I
saying.
heard that. I heard the Bible from
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Judges and Jesus thing, but you don't even have to look at the verses to prove this right, right? If you just look at the Bible as a meta narrative and you break it down,
Mm-hmm.
because I was interested in studying the Bible and seeing like the truth of it. You don't have to look necessarily at the verses themselves. If you use logic as a framework to analyze the Bible, which by the way, all Christians should do because logic precedes the Bible. I know a lot of people won't like that, but logic precedes the Bible. So you must come at the Bible with a logical
Well, the Bible
framework.
says that. I
Does
mean,
it?
right? Like, John, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, right? The correct translation is logos, right? Which is logic, right? And which is
Logic.
thought, right?
Mm.
Like in the beginning was logos, and logos was with God, and logos is God, right? Like it is. They're saying it is a claim that God Himself is the basis for logic and reason, right? And then there are other passages about understanding the full meaning, in like Genesis of like the breath of life and like what the breath of life means is like it's not just God breathes, right? It is God giving of Himself to mankind, and in that entails the concept of rationality and logic, right? So the Bible's own claim, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, is that logic and reason is of God, and that it has always existed from the beginning. Whenever that beginning is, where you have God, you have logic, and logic is inseparable from God. So to believe in the law of identity, to believe in the law of excluded middle and non-contradiction, right? All of these things is of God. It is kind of like it's Christianity's answer to like the Euthyphro dilemma, right? Which is like, do the gods say something is pious because piety is above them, or is it pious
Mm.
because the gods say so? And
Mm.
the Christian answer to the Euthyphro dilemma is God is not a part of, like, God is beyond that. Logic and reason is of God's creation and is of God Himself, and there is no point in which logic and reason exists without being intrinsically tied to God.
I do have problems with that, but we don't have to get into that. But I
I have
have
problems with it
logically
too. I'm a
proven.
fucking atheist. You know what I mean? Like, fucking, but like, I'm just,
True.
you know what I mean? But like, if we're talking about it and we're doing an internal critique, I'm gonna, mention it.
No, that's true. That's true, and that's definitely an interesting conversation, and that I've done
I mean, it might
extensive
be better to
research
talk
on.
to a theologian about it. You know what I mean? But I have read the Bible
Yeah,
several
I don't know.
times,
I
and
don't know if many theologians are
etc.
logicians, so that's a tough one. But what I will say
I
about the
mean, read
Bible is
read your
that
Aquinas.
oh yeah,
Aquinas is
true.
fucking a master logician, right? I
That's
mean,
true.
you don't get the Enlightenment without Thomas Aquinas. Period.
That's true. Um, but yeah, anyway, so as I was saying, the Bible in its grand narrative is this idea of, well, if you're I mean, I guess if you're any denomination of Christian, the grand idea is you must accept Jesus as a choice. You must accept him, or you must not accept him. Basically, the idea here is what precedes accepting Jesus is a choice. And so the grand idea for Christianity in all of its, its totality is the idea of the basis, the primacy, right, of choice. The primacy of choice is the most fundamental aspect of Christianity, because there's two options you can do. You can accept Jesus, you can follow Jesus, or you don't have to accept Jesus, right? Those are the two options, and it requires choice, which is the most fundamental point of Christianity. So this is why I'm against Christian nationalism, because it goes against the very nature of what the Bible's grand narrative is attempting to show us, which is that choice is the most fundamental. I would say it is the core component of existence in a Christian worldview. Choice is the reason that existence exists. There is nothing else but choice. It is intrinsically good.
I don't know that I disagree with you, but I'm a bit recalcitrant as a non-Christian to like weigh in too much on this, right? Because obviously, like, there's like the Calvinist predeterminism argumentation, right? And like the concept that like God's will supplants everything, right? So if something happens, it is according to God's will, and like a kind of like a you know what I mean? So like and then there's like this kind of, there's a lot of different arguments, to try and square, what I see as a kind of a contradiction, right? Which is God all knowing, all powerful, and all good? And if he is the, in philosophy we call like the it's like PKG, right? Powerful knowing, or powerful knowing good, right? And if God is all knowing, all powerful, and all good, right? Like, why is evil allowed to occur? And there are a lot of, there are a lot of arguments for that. And like, the modern argument for sure is that, God gifts us, or at the very least we sinned in some capacity, to be either tainted and or blessed with free will. And that, God wills that we have free will. But if God wills that we have free will, do we have free will? Like the free will determinism argument is something I would say is just is from the Christian perspective is a bit out of my wheelhouse, right? So I'm a little nervous to make too large of grand claims in that domain. I don't necessarily disagree with you. I think you're right, but again, definitively speaking, like it gets rough.
So two things there, and I'm actually a perfect segue that you brought it to the as you call it, the POT problem or whatever.
PKG.
So that's a perfect segue, because I was actually going to talk about that next. But the first thing that you said, which is that determinism and choice don't necessarily actually disprove each other, because choice can reside within determinism. So the idea of what we think about determinism is,
I mean, that's the objectivist argument, and that's also like Daniel Dennett's argument, right? Like exactly. Objectivism and Daniel Dennett both kind of agree, which is, which Daniel Dennett called it like soft determinism, right? Which is a bit of an oxymoron, right? Like it's either determinist or it's not. But I'm fine with it as like a name, right? But like, you are determined by your environment, by your genetics, by your, by all of these other things, to have, certain choices available to you, some of which are not available to you. If you're low IQ, you can't think of high IQ concepts, right? If you don't have any money, you can't choose to buy something regardless of whether or not you want to buy it, right? So there is a certain deterministic element to the world, in that reality exists, and that reality, with it has constraints on our choice. But the concept, objectivists have, I think, the strongest argument for free will. But I won't get into all of that, but they have a very, very good proofing for the concept that if you are conscious, right, then you have choice.
Okay, yeah, that's totally fair. But yeah, so the Calvinist view wouldn't necessarily disagree with that point about choice, because even though God can see what will happen, it doesn't necessarily mean that we can see what will happen. And what's important is that we see what's happening. We can't see it in the future. We can only see it in the present. So we're making choice based on everything we know in the past and the present. We can't know the future. So we still have choice, even though everything's determined. But the second thing with that argument you said, and this is actually what's interesting about the Euthyphro dilemma that you said, where God is logic or something. I don't know if that's what you believe or not. Internally speaking.
The Euthyphro. Yeah, no, I was just talking about what I believe. I think the Bible is claiming, right?
Right.
Not necessarily what I believe. I'm an atheist, right? I was just bringing up the
internally
dilemma.
Yeah, like internally.
Yeah. It's like it's a classic example of that, right? Of like the like, is it right because God says so, or is it right because it's right? And if it's right because it's right, then does that mean that the gods are capable of erring and being wrong? Or does that mean that the gods are less powerful than some law of the universe? And if that's true, right? Then that means that God is just a stronger version of us. He's not he's just a more powerful being. It's not like a diviner of the laws of reality and the universe, and vice versa. That means what is right and what is wrong is just meaningless and arbitrary if it's only right or wrong because God says so. So either way,
exactly.
Why would you worship God? Fuck them, right? But like the Christian answer is just that they're one and the same.
Well, yeah, no, it's actually funny that you said that, because as that problem, like the problem of evil and the problem of the idea of, omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence, meaning all knowing, all powerful, all good, God cannot be these three things at once in a logical system because they contradict each other. You cannot be all good and all knowing and all powerful and not stop the injustices of pain, because the truth is, if God is all those things, he never would have invented suffering. He could simply make us have choice and birth us into heaven. That could simply be the choice that he did. And so the thing here is that claim, if God is all three of those things, he is either one, he doesn't exist, or two, he doesn't have all three of those traits, or number three, and I find this would be the most convincing, God is illogical. He does not operate within logic. And this is why I see him as separate as logic, because it makes the most sense that a first mover, I forget what Plato called it, but the first mover would have to create something.
He called it the unmoved mover.
The unmoved mover. That's right. It makes the most sense to me that the thing that we refer to as God must be above logic, because within a logical framework, logic is necessary, but outside of a logical framework, logic can't operate outside of logic, if that makes any sense. The logic is inherent to the universe, right? The universe is a closed system that operates beyond on logic, but logic doesn't necessarily operate outside of an enclosed space, such as the universe. There's something called non-existence.
Yeah, I mean, like the problem that I have, well, I have many problems with Christianity, but one of the problems that I have with Christianity, right, is this very discussion, right? I can't really genuinely, I have a hard time wrapping my mind and steel manning the opposition to this problem, right? Because every time I try and find someone to get into the nitty gritty on this, it kind of just becomes well, God's outside of that. Okay, well, what do you mean God's outside of that? Well, God is unfathomable in that domain. Okay, well, so God's illogical? Well, no, he's not illogical.
Yes,
okay,
illogical.
Well, here's why he's illogical. well, it doesn't matter because God's outside of that domain. Like I've yet to hear, and again, I'm not, I'm an amateur in every field of study out there, with the exception of maybe like counseling. Counseling is of all the things that I argue on the internet, like, reading, psychotherapy research is the only thing that I can consider myself like actually well trained and knowledgeable, and everything else I'm just an amateur in. Um, but yeah, like I've yet to find one, and I hope that I do. If someone has a link or wants to DM me one where like there's a better answer than that is given, I'm sure there probably is some fucking ortho bro, like 55-year-old dude that's like beyond the domain of like reasonable IQ that is an argument there somewhere. And the reason I say that is because faith is a strong fucking motivator. And so you're somewhere out in the world is a 150, 160 IQ dude who's a devout Christian that has like spent his life answering this problem and probably has a good argument. I'm just unaware of it.
Yeah. No, that's fair. I wouldn't say that there's logical proof that the Christian God exists. I would say that there's logical proof that a first mover exists, because infinite regress doesn't exist. And that's a totally different conversation. I don't know if you want to go down that road, but infinite regress, it's not a thing. It's not real.
That mover doesn't have to be conscious. That's the thing. Like we can still be the first.
Obviously. Thing. Yeah. Like the first mover doesn't necessarily have to be the Christian God, but we know that a first mover does exist. We don't know what it is. It's outside the systems of logic, but it does. Oh God, that's a fucking weird thing to say. It doesn't exist.
Yep.
Because to exist, you must be within the universe, which is within a logical framework. So technically it's outside of existence. But like there's not a word to I've had this conversation before, but you can't really discuss non-existence because there's no words that exist that talk about non-existence, because all words within existence describe something within existence.
Well, so it's a weird conversation. But again, and then there's the question of like, not necessarily, right? Existence could have always existed.
No, it can't.
Presumably if you think of time as linear, which it is, right? There has to be a start point. But then what is before the start point? How does existence come from nothing?
Yeah.
That's the entire foundation for creating, religion in the first place, right?
Well, so the thing that we know for certain is that infinite regress is a contradiction. It doesn't exist because it goes against the law of causality, and the law of causality is a corollary of the laws of logic. So we know that infinite regress does not exist. It doesn't exist. So within the closed space of the universe, it did have a beginning. It has to, because the law of causality says that everything has a cause. And so it had to have a beginning because everything has a beginning, everything has an end.
Yeah, but the problem is what in what capacity could cause come from non-existence?
It would have to be in a logical mechanism. That's in a logical mechanism outside of existence. So it's beyond our understanding.
Who fucking knows? Yeah, it's beyond our understanding, right? But the problem with that, right, is once you admit that, all of a sudden, the argument that God is out of logic doesn't seem that illogical, right? If you admit that there's beyond the realm of our logical ability to understand, there is a first mover, right? Then the claim that God is outside of logic and our capacity to understand is a perfectly valid claim because you two also believe that. Now, does it need to be an absentee father figure in the sky that gets mad when I masturbate in the shower drain because I'm fucking wasting my semen on the floor instead of putting it in the belly of a whore? No. But the claim that, God allows evil to exist and therefore is illogical and therefore he's not all powerful, knowing, and good, the Christian response that God is outside of our domain of logic and that we simply can't understand his means is actually a perfectly appropriate response, because you too believe that there is something outside of the domain of logic, because there must be a causality to our universe that sprang from non-existence.
Wow, this is crazy. It sounds like you're agreeing with me.
Right. No, I mean, like, yeah, I'm just saying. I mean, like, I don't know if I'm agreeing or disagreeing. I'm just saying that, like, it is a conundrum, right? Like, I mean, like it is a currently unsolvable problem, or maybe not unsolvable, right? The objectivists would get really mad about that, because all of existence is knowable. because consciousness is what is utilized to see existence and to measure existence.
Yeah.
But how do you, how do you argue against non-existence?
It's kind of, well, the thing is, you need to know
There's a
the
reason I'm not
power
a
of
pure
logic.
fucking. There's a reason I'm not a pure objectivist, right? Like, because when you
Right.
get really, really deep into the nitty gritty, you will eventually find things where you just can't you can't come up with an answer.
Well, that's because you need to know the extent of logic. Logic is a powerful tool. It's the basis for thought, but you need to understand where it doesn't work. It works within existence. It doesn't work outside of existence.
Man exists as a function of time. All right.
It's crazy.
I can't really pay attention to chat because evolutionary capitalism is spurting, but like I'm not mad because it's just chat engagement. So I mean, like, have fun, boys.
Oh, dude.
Like,
Dude, evolutionary capitalists must be fucking freaking out because I said that infinite regress is not a real thing, and he believes in evolution. He probably fucking hates that.
Like, yeah, it's fine. But yeah, so I mean, I feel like we've run that to its logical end quite literally.
Yeah. Yes.
So your argument is that Christianity is the best argument or purveyor of anarchism.
It's the greatest moral, if it is true, it's like the greatest moral foundation for the NAP, because the most fundamental point of existence in a Christian worldview is choice. And so this is why Christian nationalism doesn't work, because Christian nationalism wants to ban.
Thing about objectivism?
I mean, I guess you could. I guess the word I used is bad. I should have said the most influential. Or
for sure.
What I mean to say,
has far more
most influential. What I mean to say is, if you're a Christian, you must accept anarchism as, the truth or the purpose behind creation. Because, like I said before, Jesus or God put us here to have a choice, because there's nothing else. There's literally nothing else you can identify. It's not the pursuit of pleasure, because pleasure is a material means, but also it can't be pleasure because we have an eternal life ahead, and the whole point of Earth, the whole point of the reason for being here is to make the choice of to go with Jesus or not to go with Jesus. So people must have
obviously
the
it's
choice.
not pleasure, all right? Like, that's the whole point of eating the forbidden fruit, right? It's like that there are lines one ought not cross, right? That there is a domain of choice that, it is good to not choose, right? It is, like, you're given the freedom to make the bad choice, right? But you ought to choose the good choice.
Exactly. And so anybody who advocates for Christian nationalism isn't advocating for the correct, and I can say this definitively, the correct, within the Christian framework, it is not the correct way of conducting Christianity. Because the thing that makes life important in God's perspective is the choices that we make on earth, which determines our outcomes. We're not supposed to have a dictator to say, okay, I'm going to force you to be good, no prostitution, no like shady businesses, none of this bullshit. We will force you to be good and you will go to heaven. No, that's not the point of Christianity. Yeah. The point of Christianity is to choose to be good.
I don't disagree with you that is a good interpretation, right? Like, because it matches my values, right? But the other problem is, like, God also ordered fucking Israel, right? The Jews leaving Egypt, right, to slaughter the Canaanites. He ordered this. And the reason that, like, one of the primary reasons that northern Judea, southern Judea, right, that Israel falls, one of the primary reasons why his chosen people failed is because they did not honor their side of the covenant in wiping out everyone in that region, right? Like, that is the failure of the Jews, one of the primary failures of the Jews, right? Every book of Judges, and then, all of the judges that I would include as, obviously not book of Judges 1 and 2, but like, Isaiah and Samuel and, like, all of these books, right? And, detailing the historical account of, like, the fall of Israel, right? Every one has these other reasons, right? God says Israel is a basket, or sorry, Judea is a basket of ripe fruit in the summer sun, right? Which is to say everything looks good now, but very soon that fruit is going to rot, right? Because fruit rots, especially when you set it out in the summer sun, right? That it's doomed to failure because of its choices, right? In Amos, probably the most woke, book, right? Some of those failures include not taking care of widows, not taking care of the poor and the elderly, right? And then always over and over and over again before Jesus, right? It's like not good enough sacrifices to me, right? You haven't been burning the right goats. You've been giving me your shitty goats, and I'm pissed. And then, of course, also present in one of those is like worshiping Baal and having sex parties and shit, right? It's like you're worshiping these other gods. I'm the one true God. And like this is why the Babylonians are going to come and genocide you, and you're going to be a captive people. And it's not my fault. It's because you didn't honor your covenant, right? And it's like, well, the covenant is, cyclical in nature, in the sense that like God never breaks a promise. God is only waiting for you to fulfill your end of the promise before your promise can be realized, right? So it's not God that's breaking the promise, because God doesn't break promises, right? But you broke a promise, and therefore the promises that he gave will not see fruition until some other time, right? So he promises you a promised land. He's not, and then your promised land gets taken over, and it's like, what the fuck, God? You promised us this land. It's like, yeah, I didn't say when. I'm outside of time, and you're not fulfilling your end of the covenant, and because you're not fulfilling your end of the covenant, you're suffering those consequences. So, I mean, if God wills you to murder people, right, and to conquer land, the concept that like free will is tantamount, and therefore any form of a nation state that uses rules and laws to impose order onto its people is in contradiction. Again, we get to this point where like, well, also God is in contradiction with that
Yes,
concept when he orders people to go and kill themselves, right? Or
that's
like when he
correct.
orders, right? Like when he wills that the Babylonians are going to come and kill everybody, right? So it's like, I agree with you that Christian anarchism is correct, and that is the right interpretation, I think, right? But there are some problems there, right? Because the Bible itself clearly shows that God can and will order, genocide.
Scott, that's not
So
even
it's
the
like,
strongest. I'm gonna fucking steal man. First of all, I'm not a Christian apologist. I'm very interested in Christianity.
yeah, of course,
Being
same
being a
here.
Christian, I'm very interested in it. So I'm not an apologist. But number two, let me steal man the fuck, because you haven't even scratched the surface. Think about this, right? God is going to have millions, possibly billions of people burn for eternity. That is infinite suffering. That's way more than
Hold on,
wiping out
hold on,
10,000
hold on.
population of what?
Where in the Bible, right? Where in the Bible is it actually detailing that Christians are sent to burn in hell for eternity? Where is this?
Not Christians, non-believers, right?
Right. Well, yeah. Well,
In
yeah.
Revelation?
Non-believers, right?
In Revelation?
Right. When is it? Now you okay? Where else? Is it anywhere else, or is it only from John the Revelator?
You think that's not true? I'm actually curious about this. I don't know.
Well, I'm just saying, like, there are plenty of sects of Christianity that don't recognize Revelations as part of the Bible. Revelations, the Apocrypha, obviously, there you're gonna have an issue with like, oh my God, what is the other books? Not the Nag Hammadi scrolls, but the ones the Ethiopians think is canon. It's like Moses's grandpa or some shit. Moses is that talks about like the fucking Anunnaki and shit, right? But they're like, obviously, let's set Ethiopians aside. They're an obvious outlier with that, right? But the Catholics believe in the Apocrypha.
Right.
I don't know. I don't know if the Orthodox do. I don't think they do, right? But let me grok this. Actually, let me fucking ask Grok. Which denominations of Christianity do not believe in revelations.
So this is weird. Do you think that
So Eastern Orthodox is one, apparently.
they don't believe in eternal damnation?
It does include it in the Book of Revelation in its canon. Its interpretation and emphasis differ from Western Christianity. Okay. Heavily on end of times theology as some Western denominations. Okay. Jehovah Witnesses, Mennonites, Wahhabists.
Okay.
I mean,
Okay.
there's a lot. Apparently, there's a lot of different arguments. Okay. Apparently, more people accept Revelations than I thought, but fair enough.
Yeah. I mean, listen, dude.
I thought it was more common.
I'm not a Bible expert by any means, but I do see a few verses that seem to say, like Matthew 25:46, those who are not righteous go to eternal punishment. Jesus says that those who blaspheme against the Holy Spirit are guilty of eternal sin. I don't know. That's interesting. See, because it would be interesting.
In Revelations, is it like describing like a place that's torturous, right? And
right.
Then it's like fiery Gehenna, which is like a trash pit outside of like a Roman city where they like burn trash, right? Like the concept of like Satan, right? In like, in hell, poking people with fire sticks and shit like that is like that's all like Paradise Lost and like Dante's Inferno.
But
right? Like that's a modern interpretation.
There is a satanic like figure
it as like
in the New Testament.
You could just say you go into nothingness.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, so I mean, that's quite like, what is that punishment? Non-existence. We don't even fucking know what that means.
This is another thing which I disagree with the traditionalists about, which, by the way, Scott, is hilarious. The traditionalists are the statist versions of Christians, and the sola scriptura, the Protestants, are the anarchist or the decentralized portion of Christianity. The traditionalists are the state, and I actually did a deep dive on Christianity and learned that every single bad thing that ever happened by Christians were, guess what, Scott, done by traditionalists because of their centralized power systems. Isn't that crazy, dude? It's almost like centralized is usually bad.
I feel like you could know nothing about the church and still arrive at that as an obvious, an obvious thing. Right?
I don't think that's
like the
obvious.
Eastern Orthodox like marching in to like kill a bunch of Christians because they changed the fucking hand sign from like this to like this or some shit, like wild shit. Like, yeah. I mean, like a lot of things have been done in the name of Christianity, but again, I always kind of go back to Aquinas, right? Which is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, Logos, right? So logic is of God, and reason is of God, and our ability to perceive the natural world, as well as our ability to think critically and reason, is all of God. And the biblical text is also of God. However, Aquinas makes the argument that when there's a contradiction between your reason, your logic, your knowledge of the observable universe, and your interpretation of the Bible, one of these is wrong. Because he makes the argument, like long before Ayn Rand, that contradictions don't exist in reality, right? I mean, obviously, Aristotle kind of is too, right? But I mean, he's making that from the Christian perspective, right? Which is, if the Bible says this and logic says this and those contradict, either your logic is wrong in some way or you're misinterpreting the Bible. That's not actually what the Bible means, because despite the fact that it is, divinely ordained, what is it called? Revolutionary monotheism, as opposed to evolutionary monotheism, right? Revolutionary monotheism, bringing about some scripture that like sets the standard. If your interpretation of that contradicts with your logic, then either your logic's wrong or your interpretation's wrong. And there's a ton of shit like that in the Bible, right? Like until like the mid 1980s, there was this passage, right? It is as easy as a rich man to go through the gates of heaven as it is for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle, right? And like most people interpreted that like it was essentially impossible for a a rich man to go to heaven, right? And then one day we learned through through archaeology that the eye of the needle is not a fucking sewing needle. It's not a needle for thread. It's a bar. It's a piece of wood that is placed on the gates of oases in the desert so that camels with their humps can't get into the oasis. However, they can be let in, and also sometimes they can crouch because camels are really smart. And like, it just means it's hard. It just means it's harder to get into heaven as a rich man than it is as a poor man, because there's an assumption there that some of your wealth may have been gotten through ill-gotten means, right? And that you may be like hoarding it, because Christianity, unfortunately, is altruism, in that there is a belief in tithing.
Actually, I disagree with the idea that Christianity is altruism. But I know I'm probably the only Christian in the world who believes that. I don't want to get into it because you're probably gonna think I'm fucking insane.
You get what I'm saying, right?
I do. I get what you're saying.
You know what I mean? Like, so there is often going to be misinterpretations, because like I live in Virginia, right? My family is from Appalachia. Okay. Coal mine, hillbillies, Melungeons, right? Like mix of Native American, very slight, a lot of mixed black, and a lot of Scotch Irish, from like people that lived in the mountains for years and years and years. Kind of forced to the edge of Native American territory by the Southern aristocracy, right? And sometimes I go and visit, rarely, but sometimes I go and visit out in the mountains of Appalachia. And I'm telling you, this is in the same state in Virginia, where I go a couple 100 miles. I drive, to the mountains, and I go and I talk to people. I can't understand half of what they're fucking saying. Okay? There are idioms and phrases I don't get. And then part of it is just the way that they speak. They have incredibly thick, difficult to understand accents when you get deep in the mountains. Now, I am talking about someone that is a quick drive away in the same state, and we are contemporaries living in the same time with the same media and relatively similar cultures. Obviously, Appalachia culture is a lot different than, city folk, but nevertheless, right? Like, we're both Americans. We're in the same system of governance, right? All of these things. So the idea that like we have a really good understanding of like scripture written somewhere between 286, I think is the earliest one, right? To 400 years after the death of Jesus, originally in Aramaic, or at least some of the, the source material is in Aramaic, 2,000 years ago in another region of the world. The idea that there's not going to be some and then that Aramaic then has to be translated multiple times before it comes to us. The idea that some shit's not getting lost in translation would be fucking insane, right? Like it would be batshit nonsense to think that like you're perfectly understanding the meaning conveyed in those scriptures. There's especially with the Old Testament. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
To be fair, there was a group of Jews with the Old Testament. And they had like I can't remember their name, but they had like an incredibly complex system of like dots and numbers that they used to copy their Bibles. And like, if like one letter or one thing was off, like the whole book would be burned. And then they had like intense clerical records. And like that happened for like fucking like 800 years. So like the Old Testament actually was kept pretty fucking well in its like, chain of custody of like not being mistranslated as time goes on. But nevertheless, right? Like these, like we don't know, right? But like some of these stories are probably tens of thousands of years old, right? The corpus of the documents is probably somewhere between 8,000 to 6,000 years old. Some shit's getting lost in translation. You know what I mean?